might want to...
What kind of a tree are you? If you think you're a tree now.
Oh, I like everybody would like to be an oak tree. That's very strong and very pretty.
No, I turned it up way loud.
Oh, okay.
Well, I wanted to make sure you could hear it. I wanted to make sure that the people on the other side of Mission Bay could hear it.
Mission accomplished. Barbara Walters herself, my dear.
All right.
Church of the Oak Tree.
So, prior to camp, how many of you ever heard of Barbara Walters? And those of you that weren't in camp, how many people have heard of Barbara Walters? Okay. It's only the people that are over the age of 25. You heard of her, Simone?
Yeah. You said her name.
I said before camp. So, all right. So Barbara Walters was one of the most famous interviewers of all time. She's actually still alive. She is 92 years old.
Wow.
So 92. She had a show called 2020, and it had nothing to do with the year. But I remember when the year started, they did all this Barbara Walters stuff saying 2020. And little did we know what 2020 was going to be like. So I'm going to move on. But this question about what kind of tree would you be is considered one of the dumbest questions of all time. Like, it's become famous of like, why would you ask someone what kind of tree they are? So there's a whole like conversation, and they actually, if you listen to the whole conversation, it did build off something prior, but it just was one of those things that just kind of hit me when I was coming up with this sermon about a tree. And in the Bible, we have so many examples of trees. And I just started thinking kind of like all the different kinds of trees there are and all the meanings that these trees have. So starting in Genesis, does anybody know what day of the 6 days of creation the trees were made? And if you paid attention to Tony last night, he did read that. And if you weren't there last night, I'll give you a pass. But you've probably read Genesis 1 before. I've got a guess of the 4th day in the back. Anybody else want to guess a different day?
Sure, we'll go 3.
3.
Yeah,
Ezra's saying 3. We got day 5. We got day 7. Of course, day 10. Awesome. It's actually the 3rd day, which is amazing. Like, you would think it's a little bit later than that probably, but no, it was the 3rd day. Okay. Garden of Eden in Genesis is where we really are going to start here, looking at some of these trees in the Bible and their meaning, and kind of, we're going to tie this all into camp here at the end, because you're probably wondering, what we do at camp had to do with trees, other than the place we went to was called Pine Valley. There's more to it. And those of you that weren't at camp, we are still glad to have you here. And this is not going to be just for people that were at camp. In the Garden of Eden, there were tons of different kinds of trees. There's a lot of great fruit trees and all these kind of trees. And Adam and Eve were told that they could eat of any tree, except for one. Now, there was a tree called the Tree of Life there that was like a very, very special tree. That tree they were allowed to eat from. The tree they couldn't eat from was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I am so amazed. You guys are awesome. So yes, that was the tree they weren't allowed to eat from. But the tree of life, they could. How cool is that? And all these other kinds of trees. And it's the fall of man starts with one tree. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that's where we fell, and humans left the Garden of Eden, and sin entered our lives. Powerful tree. Did the tree do it? No. But the tree definitely represented something. Now, in Genesis, there's a lot more trees than just those two. So, we go down to Noah cutting down trees to build his ark, right? And then Abraham. Abraham was this mighty man of God who God told him to leave his homeland of Ur to go to Canaan. And this is how the Israelites first come to the promised land. And it's funny because I say Israelites. Abraham's the founding father. He's one of the founding fathers. Israelites actually that name comes from his grandson. So it comes a little bit later. But there's a couple of spots here where they talk about the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. And it's like Genesis 12 here. It says, Abraham traveled through the land as far as the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. So this tree was so big that it was used to say where he traveled from Ur to. Think about how big that tree had to be and that it became a landmark. One of the landmarks of Pacific Beach Presbyterian Church is this big palm tree right here. When they made a video about this church back in 1988, on the 100th birthday of this church, that video was narrated by that palm tree. So palm trees can even talk. Just like the donkey we saw in the movie today, right? So trees can serve as landmarks. When you think of like sequoias and the big redwoods and all those things and just how huge they are, I'm sure the great tree of Moreh wasn't quite as big as those, but it stood out. And because it stood out, it was a landmark. I kind of paid attention to the big tree in front of the cabin this weekend. That pine tree was huge. That served as a landmark, although I couldn't see that at night after we left the loft that first night, and so I went the wrong direction. But having a landmark can help you know where to go and where you are. Another purpose of a tree. We also have here in Isaiah, this is chapter 65, verse 22. No longer will they build houses and others live in them, or plant and others eat. For as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. My chosen ones will long enjoy the work of their hands. Okay, a tree not only can be really tall, not only can it talk, only in that video. Trees are very old. Like they can get to be super, super old. So there was a tree that I planted when I was like 5, 6 years old at my church growing up. And that tree is huge now, but that tree will be there long after I'm gone. Those sequoia trees, there are trees there that literally were on the earth when Jesus was walking on the earth. 2,000-year-old trees. Think of the foundation of those trees. So trees can also represent longevity. They are strong. They can be majestic looking, and they're certainly majestic in their length, in their lifespans. Extremely impressive. And they kind of have a long-lasting memory. If you cut a tree down and you look at the rings, so you can tell how old a tree is, you can also see things that maybe like a fire or whatever, you can see the history in those rings. Amazing thing about a tree where it can be a storyteller of what has happened. There is in Genesis 21 a story about Abraham planting a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called on the name of the Lord after signing a treaty with a dude named Abimelech. The tree can be a sign of something. And a tamarisk tree, I wasn't quite sure. What is a tamarisk tree? So I got a picture of that for you here in just a second. And I'm like, oh, I've seen those trees before. So pretty cool looking, right? And so he planted one of those things, and that's going to stand out and be kind of noticed. What's even cooler is looking at the next picture. That's them in bloom. I'd never seen what they look like in bloom before. Amazing. So not only can these trees be majestic and they, have the longevity, they also can be extremely beautiful. Something like that just kind of makes you feel like that smile and that peace, and I just really love that look of that tree. Trees can also help us accomplish things that we want to do. Jacob, and when he was trying to get more sheep and goats from his father-in-law, he decided to take some of the bark off these trees and rip them off, making white stripes on the trees. So White Stripes is not just Jack White's old band. If y'all are old enough to know who the White Stripes are, young enough to know who the White Stripes are, maybe I'm hitting no one in that target audience. All right, so that it was through that process that he was able to get these goats, because God did some kind of little miracle here, to make the goats that looked at these white striped trees be striped and speckled and all this kind of stuff. And Jacob said to his father-in-law, give me these ones. Those are the bad ones because they're speckled or whatever. You can keep the pure colored ones. And all these baby ones were coming out speckled because they looked at these trees, and Jacob became very rich. Jacob also, by the way, is the one who was later named Israel, the real father of the Israelites, right? So pretty cool stuff. We've been talking about Exodus a lot lately. And Exodus chapter 15, verse 27, is something that was actually in Grant's sermon last week. It was probably in your sermon too. So when the Israelites get out into the desert and they're trying to find water and everything, God leads them to safety, and he leads them to this place that has, I'm starting to lose my voice here, 70 palm trees near a spring. And these palm trees were a great symbol of that cleansing water that they needed, the water they needed to sustain their thirst. And it was a sign of God's provision for them as they were about ready to partake a very, very, very long journey. Those trees symbolized God's salvation and his sustaining of them in that time period. Leviticus gave them an example or a regulation to do once they got into Canaan, and that was about the fruit trees. So fruit trees are another great example of what the trees do. They provide for us fruit. I mean, how awesome is it to have a fruit tree in your yard? I have an orange tree, and let me tell you, to eat an orange off my own tree is one of the coolest things in the world. Trees help sustain us. And God forbid the Israelites to eat from those trees for the first 3 years, kind of like resetting things in Israel. And then the people could eat from those fruit trees after that. So these fruit trees would help sustain the Israelites after they had conquered the land. And the land, it took more than 3 years for them to conquer everything that they needed to. But it gives you kind of an idea of how these trees were sustaining them, and that God had a plan and God had some limitations on it, but also allowed them to be sustained from those. I'm going to skip a little bit here until 2 Samuel. This is one of those interesting tree stories in the Bible. Absalom was a son of David. Absalom was not the most gracious son, and he decided he wanted to take his dad's kingdom. And he was riding on his horse, and there was all these battles and stuff, and his hair got stuck in an oak tree, and he was left hanging. And one of David's mighty men, Joab, who's kind of like his lead general, ended up killing Absalom as he was hanging by his hair in this tree. So this tree ended up becoming kind of a way to hold him captive and to squash the rebellion against David. The tree ends up being the sustainer of David's lineage. The tree does something valuable in the history of Israel. Oh my gosh, I used the V word just there now.
Oh, that was like the campaign.
Yes. And then the temple itself. So after David did pass on and Solomon built the temple, one of the big things that they used in the building of the temple was cedar trees. And these cedar trees came from Lebanon, which had these immense forests. And these cedars were like the best wood ever to use to create this temple. And so not only are the trees, like, they've been monuments and they've provided for people, they actually built the house of God with these trees, these cedar trees. And so people were able to come together 3 times a year at these special festivals. Plus there was other stuff going on at temple, on a Saturday basis. But think about that the wood from these trees ended up creating this beautiful, amazing temple. Sadly, that temple ended up being destroyed when the Babylonians took over. The temple was rebuilt under Ezra, Nehemiah, and all those folks. Temple wasn't as grand as it had been. Yes, Ezra gets a shout out. The temple may not have been as grand, but it still was that house of God, and it was trees that were able to accomplish that purpose. Psalms has some amazing stuff about trees. For example, Psalm 92:12. The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon. So these trees, again, being symbolic of the righteous people. Proverbs 11:30 is another good one here. The fruits of the righteous is a tree of life, and the one who is wise saves lives. There's a lot of other proverbs that use the idea of trees, especially fruit trees, of being the symbolic for God. And oh my gosh, bless you, Hannah.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
The cedar, the fragrance of the cedar, my granddad made me a little small, with little drawers and cedar. And
Uh-huh.
I would love as a little child to open the drawers and smell. And it just dawned on me the fragrance in God's house.
Thank you for sharing that for me, because
Cedar fragrance.
my mom has a cedar chest, and she keeps a lot of her important paperwork and a lot of her favorite memories are in that cedar chest. And that smell that you're talking about is definitely something.
Yeah.
So there's another use of a tree and the value of a tree.
The fragrance. Like a hope chest.
Yes. All right, I'm going to skip, but Ezekiel has some cool stuff about trees.
Don't you get $1 for every time you say valuable?
I should get $1 for every time I say valuable, because I'm going to say valuable more often than Mr. Tony's going to say y'all or fun fact.
Or let's play Jeopardy.
Yes.
Fun fact, y'all didn't
More times than Kimmy says Jeffrey no. Yes. So Ezekiel talks about wood of a vine being different from that of a branch from any other trees in the forest. Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? The wood obviously has a lot of use. And after it's thrown on the fire as fuel and the fire burns, both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything? So wood, when it's burned, as we saw last night and Friday night, and for those of you that weren't there, I'm sure you've been to a bonfire before. They provide light, they provide heat, a lot of wonderful things, right? So cool stuff. But what happens to the wood afterwards is it ends up becoming charred. And so Ezekiel goes on a little bit further. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. As I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for the fire, so will I treat the people living in Jerusalem. I will set my face against them. Although they have come out of the fire will yet consume them. And when I set my face against them, you will know that I am the Lord. I will make the land desolate because they have been unfaithful, declares the sovereign Lord. So when God throws the wood into the fire, in this instance, in the wood, obviously it can be used for heat and light and everything, but the wood is charred, and that charred wood is symbolic of the Israelites and their turning their back on God. Something we don't want to do. But that kind of leads us to a very famous story in the Bible. And actually, there's going to be two that I'm going to go to in the New Testament. Both are going to be from Matthew. So Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, starting in verse 19, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Kind of reminds me of the whole Garden of Eden story that we talked about at the beginning. And there's all these trees that were good trees. The fruit was good for eating. There was one tree that wasn't. So the majority of these trees, they're great and everything. But that person that tries to do something different, or those that go to the side or whatever, not so much. And so the whole thought of being a good tree and doing that, I think, is a really important one to think of, because the trees are definitely, they have value intrinsically, but they can lose some of that value if they make some wrong decisions. And them not producing good fruit it's a metaphor, okay? It's not exactly, but we're going to roll with it, and we're going to roll with it with one of Jesus's famous stories that can be a very confusing one too. Matthew 21. Early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" they asked. Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer." So this fig tree had leaves. And Grant, we're going to look here at pictures of some fig trees. That is what a nice fig tree looks like, with leaves. And if you look closely, you can see some little figs in there, or maybe even some big figs. But if you look at that, you're expecting to see figs on that tree. Now, if the tree looked like this next one, there's a fig tree without leaves. You're not expecting fruit on that. Jesus was showing that if you are kind of false, like you're showing this false front where you've got your leaves, but you don't have that fruit, it's to be burned in the fire. Now, the story of that for us is that our value as that tree, it should be, we are living what we say we are. Doesn't mean like you're going to be perfect all the time. Doesn't mean like you're going to screw up. But if you are saying you're a Christian, is your heart at least right towards God? You're going to mess up. You're going to do wrong things. You're going to do all these things. We know that. So we talked about at camp this weekend. You're valuable. And it doesn't matter how bad you screw up. It doesn't matter. But you want to have your heart towards Jesus. And your heart towards Jesus is that fruit. And so your leaves and your fruit, they coexist. We kind of go back to the end of the Bible in Revelation. And Revelation has one more big thing about a tree, and that's the tree of life. And that tree of life is what we saw at the beginning of the Bible in the Garden of Eden as well. That was the good one, right? That was, and it really, when we think of the tree of life, we think of Jesus. And when I think of a tree and Jesus, there's one amazing tree that was used to cut down some wooden beams. And those trees end up forming a cross where Jesus was hung. And in one sense, that sounds like horrible because it killed our Savior. But in another sense, it's the greatest thing that ever happened. Because Jesus willingly, while he knew it was going to be painful, he knew it was going to be difficult. He prayed so much in the Garden of Gethsemane, and actually was so worried that he sweated blood. That it was the most amazing gift because he took our sins on him as a burden. And that tree held him. That tree is something that we have like at the front of our sanctuary. It's something that people have around their necklaces often. That cross is a symbol of our freedom from sin through Jesus. And that was created by a tree. All these trees that I talk about have different value, different stories, but they're pretty amazing just how many things in just the Bible alone, and I'm sure you can think of other uses for trees, maybe that aren't as much in the Bible, but furniture and all kinds of other stuff, right? These posts here at this church and whatever. But trees are pretty awesome. So my question is, what kind of a tree are you?
I just thought about something, being connected with our root system going into where some trees can find the water that's like a river that's going underneath that root, that we want our roots to keep in contact with God's living water that keeps us nourished, so we, and also that God's not calling us to be burned out.
Yes.
He doesn't want us dried out, burned out. He wants us having that quiet time with him to keep our connection with him for his living water, to keep us nourished.
Amen. Let Jesus be our living water so our trees are well watered.